Welcome! Today we're diving into a really deep discussion about trauma theory as it's been evolving. You know, the way psychological trauma is framed and understood in both research and practice. It's fascinating how it traces everything from ancient understandings to our modern DSM and ICD perspectives.
Absolutely, it's really comprehensive. So let's start simple. What exactly is trauma according to this work?
Trauma here is pretty much defined as a biopsychosocial response to violence or threat. It's not just pure psychology or just physical injury. It's all about the emotional, cognitive, physical, and even social dimensions all coming together.
That holistic angle really brings out how complex trauma really is. And in that context, the chapter talks about the history of trauma, right from the term's ancient roots, with the Greek idea of piercing armor, all the way to modern PTSD classifications.
Exactly. It's like the narrative started with physical injury, but then expanded as wars and disasters made us realize the body and mind respond in tandem. For instance, historical accounts of shell shock in WWI evolved into our modern PTSD, which is now split between DSM's clinical lists and ICD's public health view.
Sense. Speaking of classifications, I find it interesting how the DSM-5 and ICD-11 differ. The DSM includes secondary or indirect trauma, like when professionals develop PTSD symptoms from exposure to someone else's trauma, whereas the ICD seems to get a bit more dimensional.
Yes, exactly, and that's a critical nuance. DSM-5 now actually acknowledges secondary trauma from repeated job exposures, which is key for professions like law and healthcare.
Yeah, I get that. It really broadens who can be recognized as suffering. Now, the text also dives into what they call the negativity bias. It suggests that our evolutionary wiring predisposes us to focus on threats. Like, our ancestors might have overreacted to a rustle in the bushes because it might have been a tiger.
Right. It's like our minds are tuned to be hyper-aware of negatives to help us survive, even if nowadays we're not dodging tigers.
Exactly. That overgeneralization can persist even in safe environments. But don't you think there's a bit of a leap there? I mean, while negativity bias is well documented, I sometimes wonder if the analogy overly simplifies the myriad factors that contribute to how we perceive trauma.
That's a fair point. It might simplify complex cognitive processes, but it's a useful starting point. It really reminds us that our responses, even if they seem irrational today, were once survival mechanisms.
The analogy is helpful even if it's not the full picture. Moving to the types of trauma, the chapter distinguishes between primary and secondary trauma, as well as complex trauma. It's interesting how primary relates to direct, like being in combat, while secondary is about indirect exposures.
Absolutely. And then you have complex trauma where it's not just one event, it's cumulative, like ongoing abuse or prolonged exposure to violence, evolving into things like complex PTSD, which is, both a diagnostic challenge and a reality for many survivors.
That cumulative aspect really changes one's whole self-perception over time. And then there's the intergenerational transmission of trauma, which I think is one of the most striking parts. Trauma isn't just an individual event. It can ripple through families and communities.
Exactly. It's fascinating to see that research now indicates trauma can be passed down via, say, epigenetic changes. Consider the research on Holocaust survivors, where children seem to inherit this heightened vulnerability to stress.
Right, it's like the trauma imprints itself beyond the direct victim. The whole discussion on vicarious trauma, especially in legal practices, was also eye-opening. Lawyers working with traumatized individuals not only face burnout, but also secondary trauma effects that change their worldviews.
Yes, and I love the analogy presented where working with traumatized clients can essentially alter a lawyer's cognitive schemas. almost like their lenses on life become tinted with the suffering they witness.
That cognitive transformation can be profound, and it goes further. Talking about conditions like burnout, compassion fatigue, secondary trauma stress, even moral injury in situations like military or health professionals facing traumas of their own actions.
Right. The chapter really maps out how these conditions interlink. Burnout, for example, isn't just extreme tiredness. It carries over into reduced empathy, increased cynicism, and a drop in job performance. And then compassion fatigue overlaps with secondary trauma stress, but is distinctly about that empathic overload.
It's like overinvesting emotionally until you just run dry. I also found the discussion on trauma symptoms very technical, going through cognitive, emotional, physical, even neurobiological impacts. It ties into how trauma affects the brain, from the amygdala being like a reactive teenager to the prefrontal cortex getting diminished capacity under stress.
Yes, exactly. It's like the brain's learning part versus the survival part get out of sync when trauma kicks in. The amygdala's overdrive can cause a cascade of stress hormones that derail the hippocampus, leading to memory and emotional regulation issues.
Effects. And they even mention physical ramifications, like disruptions in circadian rhythms, impacts on the immune system, even increased risks for cardiovascular problems. It's a reminder that trauma isn't confined just to our minds.
Right. It emphasizes this biopsychosocial model. Our bodies remember trauma, not just our minds. So things like disrupted sleep, high cortisol levels, and even changes in metabolic processes can all be linked back to traumatic stress.
That intersection is really compelling. And what about the strategies mentioned for resilience? The text covers self-care, reflective practices, and even the encouraging concepts of vicarious resilience and post-traumatic growth.
Absolutely. That is one of the most hopeful sections. It suggests that by understanding trauma theory and applying self-care or reflective practices, individuals and even professionals can transform their experience. Witnessing clients' recovery can itself foster vicarious resilience, sometimes even vicarious post-traumatic growth.
Right on, turning pain into an opportunity for growth really rounds out the narrative. There's also a really interesting socioeconomic perspective. They note how, for instance, gender, age, attachment styles, and even workplace culture can contribute to or mitigate trauma vulnerability.
Yes, and that creates a framework that isn't one size fits all. It's like every person's risk and recovery process is intertwined with their unique personal history and context. That model, the 3E model, event experience effects, is instrumental in designing trauma-informed policies in workplaces, especially in legal and health sectors.
Tailoring interventions is key rather than a blanket approach. Now, one might say that with all of these complexities, it seems almost overwhelming to implement trauma-informed practices everywhere. Do you think the framework is realistic in real times?
It can feel that way, but the whole point is progressive improvement. The chapter makes it clear that while our understanding is complex and sometimes fragmented, applying even small shifts, like self-care routines or better supervision systems, can make a big difference.
Incremental changes can indeed have massive impacts over time. And lastly, the takeaway seems to be about the long-term hope. Recovery and growth are possible even after severe trauma, both individually and vicariously in professionals.
Absolutely. It reminds us that trauma, despite its pervasive adverse effects, doesn't have to define one's entire life. With proper awareness, support structures, and an informed approach, resilience, and even growth is achievable.
That blend of humility and empowerment is really inspiring. Well, this conversation really opens up the conversation on trauma theory, not just as an academic field, but as a lived dynamic reality shaping countless lives today.
Indeed. And whether we're considering historical contexts or individual experiences, Understanding trauma in its full complexity is essential for creating safer, more compassionate environments in every sphere, from courtrooms to clinics.
Absolutely. It's crucial work that's only getting more relevant as our society evolves. Thanks for walking through these layers of trauma with me. It certainly leaves me thinking about how we can implement these insights practically in our fields.
I'm glad we talked about it. It's a field with both challenges and inspiring opportunities for positive change. Until next time, keep reflecting and supporting those around you.
Right. Take care and keep questioning.